Today we're going to talk a little bit about misfires, and one that I dealt with on my own vehicle. I just wanted to pass this along. Now, in the past I've had a little trouble when I inserted a video into the slides where there would be noise from a video and me talking over it. I'm going to try to avoid that this time. Not all my videos, some of the sound is muted on the videos, some of it's not. So there may be times when you're just listening to me talking the video and my little face is down here in the screen or whatever, but let's move on with this thing. Now, whenever we're scoping an ignition system, they look different now than they used to when there was just distributors and whatnot. But basically what you got right here, and you can see this, the way that it operates, you know, whenever the points would close. This is an electronic ignition here. This is not exactly what it would look like if you were using points, but this is your dwell, the amount of time the points are closed, where the current limiting stops the saturation from building in the coil. On those E-core coils, they've only got about 1/3 of an ohm, and so if you actually try to short that out straight and solid like you did an old oil-filled coil, like on some of your DuraSpark or whatever, the oil-filled coil could take a little bit of dead short, you know, on their primary terminal, so that the coil was just saturated and held that way. But these E-core coils cannot handle that. It will destroy one of those, and so that's a different thing. So basically you got your current limiting going on right here. That's whenever it's saturated and it's ready, and this ordinarily would be where the points would open, right at this spot right here. Takes more juice to pop across there, but when it starts burning the fuel, that's your spark line, and that's measured from here to here in milliseconds typically. Now that upkick right there means it has used up the fuel that's helping the spark conduct through that mix, and the resistance increases in there until it snaps, and then this is your leftover energy and all that. If you don't have any leftover energy, if it just looks like that, you typically have a weak coil or something feeding the coil is a problem there. Now, misfiring is a common concern, and whenever I used to, if you stand in a parking lot and you watch a lot of cars go by, it's not terribly unusual to hear one skipping, pop, 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 pop. You know, you can hear it from the exhaust pipe. I'll talk about that a little bit again in a minute, or I'll show you that. But misfires can be constant, or they can be intermittent, or they can be random at idle, like the spark plugs are gapped too close or partially fouled or something like that. And they can happen under load, typically. That there was this one guy that had this Mustang that was a cream puff, totally restored, like a 66 Mustang with a 289 in it, and he brought it in and he wanted it tuned up by the best guy they had, whatever. So they gave it to me, and it was in pristine shape, and it had the old boots, you know, that you go through down into the spark plug towers. I should have had an illustration of that. And whenever I put spark plugs in it, I put points in it, a condenser and all that, because they had the old point and condenser style, and I drove it like you would drive a shiny, freshly restored old Mustang, and it ran good for me. And whenever I set the timing and all that hogwash, and, you know, adjusted the carburetor. And then the guy went and drove it and came back and says, no, he says he missed something because it's still acting up. So the shop foreman went and drove it with him, and he was tacking that thing out to redline, and it would cut out a little bit when he redlined it. And the shop foreman says, well, if my mechanic was driving your car like this, I'd have something to say to him about it. So what I found out was, whenever I hooked the big Sun Interrogator, which was a big ugly machine that we had there, that thing was showing me that it was taking like 20,000 volts to fire one of the spark plugs. I had no reason to scope it before, because he didn't tell us he had a drivability problem. He just said he wanted a tune-up, and sometimes customers will do that. Well, it turned out that, you know, when you stick that spark plug wire through that boot, instead of shoving it all the way down in there and snapping it in there where it's supposed to go, it was basically riding up in the boot, so the spark was having to jump from down in that socket up there to hit the terminal on the end of the spark plug wire, and that had excessive resistance on one of the plugs, but you only felt it when you were tacking about 5,000 or 6,000 RPM, and that's the way that guy liked to drive that thing, and I can't believe that, but anyway, that's the way that was. Well, trouble codes and high-end scan tools can help you with this. This one on the left over here is the IDS. Interestingly enough, the the Zurich scan tool I bought from Harbor Freight, which is really a pretty nice little tablet. Heck, you could use that thing for a regular computer if you Bluetooth the keyboard to it. But anyway, and it's a small thing too. It's not very big. I thought about, you know, turning it into a Kindle reader or something, you know, like that part of the time. But anyway, on the other ones, this one over here is the old scan tool I was talking about last week. This one right here, and it will, you know, it would give you, if you were actually in the enhanced part of it, it would give you the number of misfires on each cylinder and all that, which was pretty handy. If you see an excessive number of misfires on one cylinder, it sends you looking for that one. This power balance screen was a godsend for those Crown Vics and those vehicles that had the coil on plug, because those things would have a bite misfire that hard to isolate. Whenever it's just a bite like that, it would make a track. You know, the blue is your live, the green is your median, you know, and then whenever it would skip, here's one that I had pulled a picture of out of my archives and everything. And hold her hand here. All right, that means we're missing on one cylinder. What we got to do is, if it's a continual misfire, it'll sound the way the exhaust did on this one, pop, 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 and whenever and that way you know it's misfiring. Okay, so this 4.3 liter V6 that I drew in a little S10, and it was like a early 90s back vehicle. I drew that thing, and you would have swear if you were sitting in it or sitting there looking at the engine that it was skipping. But I went back there to the pipe before I did any work on it, and at the pipe, coming out of the pipe, I heard nice and smooth. I said, this thing is not skipping. It just feels like it because of an engine vibration. And I was not, before I dug too deep into it, because I really couldn't find anything blatantly wrong with it, I called the shop foreman at the Chevrolet place, because I was at the Ford place, and he and I used to talk sometime. And he says, you'll never fix that. And I said, what do you mean I'll never fix it? He said, those things do that sometimes, and whenever one of them is doing it, the only thing you can do that'll make it a little bit better is put a Caprice transmission mount, rear transmission mount on it, and that'll help some, but you're always going to have that if you've got one doing it. And basically at the Chevrolet place, and it was a big Chevrolet dealer, they had run into those and really couldn't fix them because of the, you know, product variability or whatever, and they didn't all do it. That's what's so weird to me. But I wasn't going to spend a whole lot of time trying to fix a Chevrolet and me at the Ford place if the shop foreman said they hadn't been able to fix them. And I saw another one doing the same thing after that. Back there in the used car department. And I told the guys, I said, you're going to have that vibration on this one, because I had one just like it, and it was about the same year model. But you need to make sure it's skipping before you actually go after a skip. The way the engine runs, so we know that's not the one that's misfiring. We're going to continue around the cap. Hold it, Frank. We're going to continue around the cap until we get to the one that, hold on. You're messing up. You're going to hold on there. We have, what we would do is pull the plug wires one at a time at the distributor cap usually, and you know, you can't be afraid of that thing. And, you know, a lot of times your hair's standing on end because you think you're going to get bit, you know, and sometimes you will. And it's a good idea, like I said before, to put maybe a ground strap or something like that on your arm and hook it to a alternator bracket so that you don't have so if it gets you, it'll go through that ground strap. It won't run all the way up through your chest cavity, you know. But the long and the short of it was, we would pull the wires until we found the one that wasn't making any difference or wasn't making as much. Now here's the other thing. If you stretch that spark and the one that's misfiring starts hitting perfectly while you've got the spark stretched, see, you've increased that voltage, and that definitely means you got a foul spark plug. So if it's not firing and you stretch the spark at that plug and it starts firing, I have, you know you got a foul plug. I have actually seen them where they were kind of soot fouled because of a problem with the carburetor, and I would stretch the coil spark to increase the spark power, the spark pop on all of them, and I could get one started, and stretching that coil spark a little bit, I could let it run like that until it burned all that crud off the plugs, you know, when I had fixed a carburetor issue and I knew it was having trouble starting because the plugs were sooty, or it was running rough because they were sooty. And if you stretch that spark and it starts running good, you know, I'm talking about the coil spark, you know, you can't do that on all of them because all of them don't have a coil wire. Some of them, the coil pops right from inside the cap. But the point I'm trying to make is, we would do that. We would disconnect those wires at the distributor. Now, occasionally, you'll have one that will run better. You'll have a misfiring engine, and when I learned this working at a filling station back in the 70s, you pull that thing, and if it starts running better, it typically meant you had a carbon track in the distributor cap. Now those old phenolic black distributor caps that they used to have wasn't worth a flip for that kind of what they were doing with them. And what Chrysler did to combat this natural carbon tracking issue that they had, and a carbon track is just a kind of a black snapshot of what the spark looks like when it's been jumping from one post to the wrong one inside the cap, and it starts leaving a little trail of carbon molecules, and it gets easier to follow those carbon molecules than it does to actually fire where it's supposed to. Now the issue that I had was that I was trying to make bugs whenever I first went to teaching, and some people say, oh, you can draw in a distributor cap with a pencil and it won't fire, you know. I said, well, I'm going to try to make that happen because I wanted to plant a bug. I drew all around a distributor cap with a pencil, and I never could create a problem like that, you know. But this moisture that you see inside these caps, the gray caps, the brown caps, the blue caps, they're not nearly as prone to carbon track as the old black ones were. But this moisture that you see in here was typically when somebody washes the engine, and initially they don't have a problem, but then later when they get home and all of that water steams up out of the distributor where it puddled, and it gets up there and it rests on the inside of that cap, you wind up with it just cutting up, kicking back, all that kind of stuff. Now you might notice that this right here on this one is a vent. Now whenever there's a lot of sparks popping, when Ford was using these gray caps, the ozone that would be created by all those sparks popping in that cap would cause some kind of gummy wet stuff to form that looks kind of like this moisture you see in this cap here. And so they had us putting these vented distributor caps on here so that it would let the ozone out and they wouldn't be having this problem. But that gummy stuff that was gathering on the inside of the distributor cap would run just like it had moisture in there. But if you touched it with your finger, it was sort of a syrupy gummy stuff. Okay, so that was this was what we were looking at here. So let me move on. All right, we're going to do this again. What we're going to do is we're skipping, you can tell. We're going to unplug cylinder number 1, and it runs better. And if you unplug cylinder number 2, it actually runs really, really bad. It just like kill the motor. If you go back to cylinder number 1, it runs better. What we were looking at there is when we pull that front plug wire on that thing, the engine would actually pick up speed, is what it amounted to. Not necessarily run better as much as picking up speed. When I was working at the Volkswagen dealer, there was a guy that had a lot more experience than I did, but he was over there and he was looking for a misfire on one, and whenever he pulled the distributor, the coil wire off, it ran better. And he was saying, what does that mean? And I said, I learned that back in 1975 or whenever you pull that thing off and it's running better, look for a carbon tracking distributor cap. He pulled the cap off and there it was. I don't know, it boggles my mind that he had never seen that before, basically. There was another guy that was a really good mechanic I worked with when I was doing fleet maintenance down in Texas, and I asked him, I says, just a sort of a trivia thing, I said, what does it mean when you pull the wire and the car runs better? And he looked real confused for a second. He goes, I don't know, pull them all, maybe it'll run really good, you know. But anyway, that's what was going on there. This particular one had an issue with the coil pack. See, this was one of those coil pack ignition systems, and it had a coil pack that was cross-firing on the inside of the coil pack. Another little thing, if you've got these coil rails, these big long coil rails like you see on these Jeep Cherokees, one of those does not fit all. What you got to do is make sure you're getting the right one. We put an engine in a Jeep one time, and after we put the engine in it, we put the coil rail that came with the engine in there. We just dropped the engine with a coil rail on it and everything in the Jeep, and it was kicking back like it had crossed plug wires. So we pulled that coil rail off and put the one off of the other engine on it, and it fired up. The simple fact is, all of these coil packs, even if the wires will plug in, they may be wired differently on the inside so that you'll have kicking back. One time I crossed a couple of plug wires on a trainer vehicle I had because I was trying to plant a little bit of a bug for students to go after. had the thing about raised up about waist high, which is how I like to work on one. You know, raise it up on the lift about waist high so I don't have to bend over on a low riding car. And so, like a tar, this was a Mercury Sable. And whenever it had coil pack, and I swapped a couple of plug wires around, and as soon as I tried to start it up, it kicked back so hard that it busted the starter housing, and I looked in the starters hanging from wires under there. I thought, boy, that's a disaster. What if it had been a customer's car that they accidentally had crossed wires on? Now, you're going to have a bouncing needle if you have mechanical problems. So if you've got a misfire, particularly if it's a all-the-time misfire, usually that will be if you got a bouncing vacuum needle, that typically means you got issues with your valves or some nonsense like that. And so you need to be thinking deeper than just spark plugs. Now, one time there was a Crown Victoria police car that we had for a trainer vehicle. We had a bunch of trainer vehicles, 14 of them at the time. And I told one of my guys, I says, this white Crown Victoria police unit with a 4.6, it was a 98 model, I said, it's misfiring on one cylinder and I need you to go troubleshoot it. So he went to work looking at that thing and fooling with it, and he worked on trying to figure out what was going on with the spark and all that. And he says, I don't know what's wrong with this thing. It misfires no matter what I do. And I said, have you checked the compression? He says, why would I do that? And I said, check the compression and just tell me what you find. And so he checks the compression because he was used to chasing bugs, right? That's part of the problem with trainer vehicles. If you're only teaching people to fix cars using trainer vehicles, a lot of the times a real world problem, there's not going to be anything they're going to catch. So he checked the compression, and it had a low compression on cylinder number 2, which was the one that was missing. And he said, how did you make that happen? I said, I didn't make it happen. It's got a problem. And you were overlooking it because you were assuming it was a bug that I had planted. See, and so that's one of those things right there. That just came to mind while I was doing this. Now, once you've isolated the guilty cylinder, you need to work on finding out what's going on. You gather a data point by saying cylinder number 3 or whatever is missing. And then you're going to diagnose, and you're going to figure out what do I need to do next to determine what's causing this misfiring cylinder. And there's just several different things that can have it. Typically, though, if you've got an occasional harsh misfire bite like that, then what you're going to have there is a spark problem, plug, wire, something like that, where it's leaking a spark, or maybe the plug can actually be cracked down on the inside in a place where you can't see it, and it can jump that way. As the pressure goes up in the cylinder, the spark is looking for the easiest place to go. That's the whole problem. That's also why sometimes spark starts finding places to go, punching through boots and stuff like that. Okay, so anyway, one time I was driving this Mustang convertible, little 4-cylinder, and the girl that owned it said it was brand new at the time. She said sometimes it'd misfire when she was taking off. I drove that thing and drove it and drove it and drove it. I was wasting all kinds of time. You drive it and you can't get it to act up, And so I said, well, I'm over here close to the credit union. I'll just go through the drive-thru and get me some money for lunch. Well, she saw me over there when she was driving her trainer car. And she says, not a trainer car, it was a loaner car. And she says, what are you doing driving my car to the credit union? I said, well, I had to stop at red lights anyway, so I figured I'd just go by the bank. So she said, well, let me just ride this thing with you, and I'll show you what it's doing wrong. And so she got in there, and I was thinking, oh boy, this could be a problem. So we got in that car, and she drove it and drove it and drove it and drove it and drove it. And she says, I can't get it to act up either. And I said, well, that's a problem I've been having, and that's, that led me to the credit union because I was just driving all over town, stopping at one red light and then the other. And so she calmed down a little bit. She was all, sweaty and sticky and all that kind of stuff, and she wasn't very attractive, with all due respect, And then she says, well, I won't even tell my husband about this, I'm sorry I acted so ugly and all. And she says, and I hope you'll excuse the way I look because I don't have any makeup on and I've been working in the garden. And I said, oh, you don't need any makeup. I was trying to butter her up a little bit. Anyway, what I found out on that one was there was a connector that wasn't quite seated back there that was feeding the fuel injectors. And it just so happened all of the pins were touching except for the one that would move and wiggle a little bit every now and then and stop delivering to a fuel injector. See, a fuel injector is going to cause occasional misfires if there's a wiring problem or something. Occasionally, you'll run into a fuel injector like I ran into on a Jeep one time, and it was misfiring and it wasn't operating the injector. And so what I did was, coming out, there was no injector signal. It was a sequential, and on those Jeep Cherokees back in those days, back 87 to 90, they actually had the injectors hardwired to ground, and the engine controller would send power out there, which is totally backwards from everything else that I've seen. And so what happened was I said, I'm going to go in and replace the engine controller, because I had another one on hand over there. And I plugged that thing in, and it initially was firing on that cylinder, and then it quit. And what I found out on that one was the injector only had 3 ohms of resistance, and it was supposed to have 16, and it was overheating the driver in the engine controller, so it was shutting that driver down. Well, after I replaced the injector with one that had the proper resistance and wasn't partially shorted, I put the original engine controller back on just experimentally, and it started firing the injector again, which tells me that the electronics are good and those drivers are tough or something. But anyway, it was one of those old Bendix electronic control units. Now, OBD2 algorithms look for misfires whenever within 2 windows, a 1,000 revolution window and a 200 revolution window. Now, the 1,000 revolution window is a type B misfire, as I remember, and a 200 revolution window, if it's misfiring that often, that's a type A misfire, and most of your newer systems will shut the injector down because they're afraid they're going to, during the misfire, because they're afraid they're going to damage the catalytic converter. Now, the PCM learns what a misfiring crank sensor wave looks like. I mean, what a the one that, when it's got a nice even pull, when you're coasting downhill, it'll basically take a snapshot of that waveform and a cam sensor waveform to go with it. When it misfires, it slows down a little bit, and using the cam sensor and the crank sensor waveforms together, it will try to determine which cylinder is misfiring. Now, ever so often you may see it tell you that number 2 is misfiring, when number 5 will actually be the one that's misfiring, particularly if you've got companion cylinders fired by coil packs. But one way or another, it's usually pretty good. Some of the older, we worked on one older vehicle that was about a 2000 model Asian SUV, I can't remember what it was, and it had a crank sensor, and the only reason that crank sensor was there was for checking for misfires. It had a distributor, with everything in the distributor that it needed to run was in the distributor, and the crank sensor, you could unplug the crank sensor and it would fire up and run, because the crank sensor was only there for detecting misfires, that's the only one like that I've ever seen. But I thought that was very interesting. But when you got a bite, it's typically misfire, it's typically spark related. Now, I replaced these plugs in my Explorer about 15 months ago, just because it was time for some. You might want to notice bank 1, how the wear, how it looks, the wear look at this. You see that's fairly nice and square, and there's more wear on the ground electrode. This one's the same way, this one's the same way. But look at this one here. The center electrode is rounded and worn more on bank 2 than it is on bank 1. The reason for that is, and Ford has done this all the time, the polarity is different on one side of this coil pack than it is on the other. So it's always firing in the same direction, but one of them it's firing this way and the other one it's firing that way. So the direction it's firing from is going to have a lot to do with what your spark plug wear looks like. I had showed my shop foreman one time, when I pulled the plugs out of a Crown Vic, I had them laid over there, and I said, look how the ones on the passenger bank are different from the driver bank. The wear pattern is different. And he was totally mind-boggled by that. But I've noticed it's the same way on my Explorer. I actually scoped each one of these. I did a video on this previously. But always remember that you're going to see a different wear pattern on the one side of the coil than you are the other, you see. All right, so let's move over. Now, if you get it into high gear with the torque converter locked and you go about 45 miles an hour and crowd the throttle going uphill like this, you're typically going to have your best chance of catching a skip. Now, I had my tool over here that I was using at the time, and my Zurich scan tool with power balance, which is kind of like the IDS. I will tell you the Zurich scan tool will catch a skip that misfires several times in a 1,000 RPM or 200 RPM cycle. But if it's just misfiring once on a long pull up this hill, it may or may not catch it. And so that was something I ran into on this one here. Now, I took a 14-hour round trip to Sarasota, Florida. Went down there one day and came back next, had a job I had to do down there. and I put that scan tool over in the passenger seat where it wouldn't distract me, but where it would skip, I could glance over there and see if it made a track. And what I came up with was the cylinder was on 3 or 5 or both of those. And I said, okay, so I'm focusing on cylinders 3 and 5 based on what that scan tool told me. I could have put a scope on it, but chances are, unless I recorded it and played it back while the skip was there, I probably wouldn't have seen it anyway. But one way or another, with this one here, I had determined it was on one of these 2 cylinders right here. And so that's how I attacked this. Okay, on this one here, the way that these Fords are numbered, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so 3 is going to be the back one on that side, and 5 is going to be the middle one over here. And so that's what I'm looking at here. I've got a couple of spark plugs. I don't want to replace all the plugs if I don't need to, because these plugs haven't been in there that long. But it's definitely got this little sharp bite whenever I'm pulling a hill 45 miles an hour with the overdrive and torque converter, clutch engaged, and all that. You might notice that 3 and 6 are fire and companion cylinders, 2 and 5 are fire and companion cylinders, and 1 and 4 are fire and companion cylinders. You see that? Or am I wrong about that? Nope, I screwed up on that. Wow, delete that. I'm sorry, I meant to be drawing down here. 1 and 5 are your companions, 2 and 6 are your companions, and 3 and 4 are your companions. Boy, was I ever a buffoon talking about these up here. I was looking at the wrong one. Those aren't companions. So your companions, if you do it this way, are going to be, we're going to have 1 and 5. Those are your companions that are at top dead center at the same time. 2 and 6, and then 3 and 4. That's how I should have drawn that. I apologize for making such a buffoonish mistake, but there you go. That's how that thing goes. So this coil right here fires 1 and 5. This coil fires 2 and 6, and this coil fires 3 and 4. And that's how that's set up on this one here. Now your GMs and your Dodges and stuff are numbered a different way. A lot of your V6s, the firing order on this one is 13, 25, 40, 13, let's say 1, 2, 1, 5, 3, 6, 2, 4. Or no, 14, 25, 36. I'm sorry, 1, 5, 3, 6, 2, 4 is a straight 6. Anyway, 14, 25, 36 is what you got on this one here. And so that's where your, that's how the thing fires. Anyway, so the other ones, like a lot of the V6s, just have a firing order of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 4.3 liter in the Chevy is 1, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, which it starts with 1 and then it counts down from 6, which I always thought that was kind of interesting and everything. Firing orders are not quite as important now as they used to be, unless you're doing some base engine work where you need to know where the pistons are, you know, on each stroke and all. Now, I could have scoped it, but again, I said, well, I'm going to start out by spraying soapy water on all these wires. Because when you spray soapy water on the wires, if there's a wire that's breached, or even if you got a cracked spark plug sometimes, you'll wind up hearing the thing start misfiring, and you may even see spark popping down there. On wet or foggy days, I had noticed this seemed to be worse. Sometimes it would do it backing out of the driveway. So I said, well, I'm gonna go ahead and spray this. I didn't really find anything this way. So that was a data point that I didn't get. These kind of coil packs don't usually fail. Coils like these, those little coil packs like the Motorcraft ones use, they typically are more prone to fail than these. So I'm not thinking I'm going to have any kind of a coil pack issue. But I did use my scan tool, and I think I found out that it's 5 or 3, one of those 2. And so I may change one of those plugs or both. I was looking at the fact that these coils here, these little coils, I have got this kind of coil pack on my F-150, my 07 F-150 with the 4.2 in it. It's got a coil pack like this, and I've had to replace it once already. And I had one like this on the 07 Taurus I had, but on this 06 Explorer, I got one of these very robust coil packs like that one right there. And I'm not saying they never fail, but they're less likely to fail. And so let's move on here. The Motorcraft wires that I bought, they were $70 when purchased from the dealer. I actually got these from Amazon for $41. And I laid them out on the tailgate of my wife's F-150. And then I thought after, I said, well, I really probably ought to put some newspaper on here in case I put any scratches on the tailgate or whatever, you know. So I stretched them out and I sorted them out by length, you know, and I always want to be really careful to put these plugs on there so they're configured exactly the same way that they were to start with. And that's just a you know, good way to do that. Every job is basically a picture of the person that did it. And so when somebody comes along behind you and they see the work that you did, they need to make sure that, you need to make sure that the work they see reflects the person you want them to think you are, right? So do a good job, make sure you do it like it's supposed to be. Now, on these 90 to 94 Crown Victoria, they had 2 coil packs, one for each bank. And you'd think, well, this coil pack fires this bank, the other one fires the other bank. Well, let's get sidetracked here for a minute and look at this. What we would do is take the 2 longest and the 2 shortest spark plug wires. We'd sort them out. Get the 2 longest and the 2 short ones, and we'd throw them over there on this fender. And then all the rest of them would go over here. And so if you look, 1 and 3 came from this coil, but 6 and 5 were fed from these towers. You see that? See how I got those up there? And on this other one over here, what you had here was you had 7 and 8, which were shorter wires, but the longest wire, some of the longest wires here, 4 goes all the way back here. You see what I mean? And so on and so forth. So that's why you sort them out the way you do. These coils are marked like I've got it right here, although if you buy a lot of these new coils for these, you're going to see them numbered A through H instead of 1 through 8. So don't be too confused like that. A is 1, B is 2, and so on and so forth. It's aggravating because you got to count off. Don't know why they do that. Probably an engineering thing, but Ford always had them numbered. When I would see them, when they came on the vehicle, they were numbered with numbers instead of letters. Toyota sometimes will put theirs A, B, C, and for their fire. Their cylinders will be numbered A, B, C, D, whatever, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, I've disconnected the mass airflow, and I've disconnected the closure hose for the PCV system, and I'm removing the air inlet. Oh, and that's got that little rubber thing. I'm going to pull this off and put it over here. All right, I had to pull that off to gain access. Okay, I've disconnected the spark plugs on this side, and I've pulled them out of the little loom holders. But I'm not going to be able to get these plugs out of here, these plug wires out of here, without removing the alternator. And so that's what I'm going to have to do next. Couldn't get that. It's physically impossible to get those plug wires out of there with an alternator in place. You just couldn't do it. So I had to pull the alternator off. And to do that, you had to take the belt off first. And so I got my ratchet down there, and you can see got my tensioner. And I actually didn't have to take the belt all the way off. I just unhooked it from the alternator and let it stay around the other pulleys, which that saves you work later. No use in taking the belt all the way off unless you're going to replace it. I had to disconnect the alternator wire, and there's 3 wires connected to the alternator, the big one. And it's a good idea if this boot is a pretty good protector for that. And if you take it off and you're really careful, wrap some tape around it, you can do it without disconnecting your battery. It's really wise to disconnect the battery though, so just take care of that. This is a handy little tool I bought from Harbor Freight. Believe it or not, it's really, really handy, and it's really strong. All right, that's the 3 alternator bolts. Pull them alternator bolts off. This gives us access to these plug wires, so we can go ahead and get them off of there. Now I can actually get these plug wires out of here, and I want to take them out as a complete loom and lay them on the tailgate. See, I laid them on the tailgate here. This is the old wires. They're coming from the coil over there. And I matched the length of the wires up, by holding the wire up to it and making sure I had the right one, see? And this is basically 1, 2, 3 the way this goes. So I went over there and went ahead and took that little cover off the loom and unlatched these so that I could basically just unhook the wires one at a time and put these in here exactly the same way the other ones were, so that when I got through, I had me a neat little harness right here for that number 1 bank, on the passenger side. And you know, this is my dandy long extension, and then my silicone dielectric grease, and that's really important. Put some of that stuff in there. Dielectric grease helps to prevent RFI, because what it does is that when you put that grease in there, it smears onto this whenever you're putting the plug on, and then when you snap this on there, it makes it so that the spark can't jump from here in various little places and cause radio frequency interference. Dielectric grease does not conduct electricity at all, so the only place the electricity could flow was right where the metal was touching. Now another thing it does is it keeps these boots from getting vulcanized to this ceramic where it's a darn hard to get off of there. And because I put some of this stuff on my boots whenever I changed the plug 15 months ago, it was real easy to disconnect these spark plugs. So don't neglect to use the silicone dielectric grease. Ford got smart later on and also determined that this made really good caliper slide grease, so they actually say it's caliper slide grease, but it's dielectric compound as well, see. But anyway, I keep a tube of this on hand because it's, you know, just really a good idea. You can use it for all kinds of stuff. All right, there there's that new little harness I put on there. See that? I mean, I got them all snapped on there, got them routed, you know, in the factory configuration. I actually had to straighten that out a little bit later. The plugs wires won't be exactly the same length, but one of the things I did is I got a Sharpie and numbered the wires just like the, you know, there are numbers on the wires when they come new. And I actually like to number the wires with a Sharpie by drawing a 1, a 2, or a 3 on them or whatever, just because, you know, it's just not anything you have to do, but I kind of enjoy doing that. Got my bracket out of place to start with, and I realized the way that tightened down, I needed to fix that.
On that one. Didn't have my bracket lined up. There we go.
All right, that's better. That thing puts some pretty darn good torque on them screws too. All right, got that back on there. Now that's the way these are numbered: 1, 2, and 3, and 5, 6, and 4. You know, wouldn't it be great if it was just 4, 5, and 6? But they don't do it that way because of the companion cylinders laid out the way they are. Once again, and you know, backing up to the screw up I did before, 1 and 5. This is a coil. You know, this is a coil, this is a coil, and this is a coil, and that defines your companion cylinders. If you had a distributor cap, you would find out that 1 and 5 on a 6-cylinder that's made for one of these is on opposite sides of the cap. 2 and 6 are across the cap from each other, and 3 and 4 are on opposite sides of the cap. So these coil packs are usually marked. This one here came from the factory with these marks on it right here. See that? So you don't mess up and put the. But some of these coil packs come with no marks at all on them. I mean, they'll just have a potted coil pack and there's no numbers there. So you got to have some kind of reference for that. All right, so got them all changed. I also replaced plugs 3 and 5 while I was there, just because it seemed like a good idea. Now, flashover is something that happens, and I'm showing you this for a reason you'll see in a minute. I will tell you that I despise these. General Motors got to where they were using those on a lot of stuff, and boy, those things will vulcanize to a spark plug wire on the ones that have coil packs, so that you just about have to sell a set of spark plug wires by default if you're going to replace the spark plugs on one of these, because you will rip the spark plug boots all to smithereens. I did see on the truck where they had this little thing you could buy that you could hook to your air hose and slide it down between the spark plug wire and the boot and blow it with air, and it would pop that boot loose. I built me one of those by beating a piece of tubing out flat and putting it on my blower, and it works usually, but it doesn't work every time. But anyhow, the ones that have the ribs on them like this don't vulcanize to the boot quite as bad, but it's also supposed to help prevent this flashover business. They're claiming the dielectric is better and they don't have as much of a problem doing it like this. But here's what I found. On number 3, which was one of the suspect misfires, you see this right here? Now, you look at that. That right there, you might think, well, that's just something where the spark plug protector dragged and made a little mark on it. You could not rub that off of there with your fingers. And whenever you see a spark plug that's got this kind of a track on it, it's also going to have a track inside the boot. So if you just replace the plug without replacing a wire, it's going to start misfiring again, because it's going to try to follow those carbon molecules that are etched into that boot. You can wipe them out or put dielectric grease in there, whatever you want to, but the thing about it is you're going to have issues if you don't replace the boot and the wire, regardless of how that goes. Now, I didn't measure the resistance of the center electrode on this one. I was going to include that in this video, but I didn't see any point in it because at this particular time, since I knew 3 was one of my possible misfiring plugs, I only replaced 3 and 5. I didn't replace them all because the rest of the plugs still look pretty good after only having replaced them a few thousand miles ago. Now let's look at this a little closer. I got a microscope that I use with a computer and I zoomed in on that. You can basically see that. That's not just something that's smeared on there. And you can tell by the, see if it was, it would have been a straight line coming out of there like, you know, like that. But this thing right here, you can see it here. You can see where it went across that one, and you can see where it went across that one. Now it didn't go down in the valley because it never does that anyway. This is another spark plug, a Bosch Platinum that I had, that I came out of another vehicle, and it had a real heavy carbon track where it had been misfiring something awful. Personally, I don't like Bosch Platinum spark plugs, and I never really have. Sometimes when I had one that was running bad, if it had Bosch Platinums in it, I would remove those right away and put some regular Motorcraft plugs in it that were gapped right and all. Anyway, there's one right there that was popping down the outside, and Bosch's don't always fail that way, but one way or another, that's another example of that flashover carbon tracking. First time I ever saw that was on a 91 Explorer. It don't usually happen on vehicles with distributors. Usually it'll be on coil pack ignition because the energy is so much higher. Coil packs usually pop with about 110,000 volts. Distributor ignition might hit, you know, 60, 80,000 at the most. Anyway, that's I've been driving my Explorer for a few days. After I did that, hadn't had a single misfire, and I've driven it trying to duplicate it again. All the misfires gone, and I feel like I got it with the number 3 plug, but I replaced the wires. Back when I was working at the Ford dealer, I just replaced one wire. If I found out that one wire was all it was bad, because they would sell it that way. The spark plug, most of the parts houses didn't like selling just one wire, and if they did, it was one that wasn't the right length or something like that. Anyway, I really appreciate you guys listening to me, and I hope you'll come around next week, and I'll see you then.